She says she wants kindness. She says she wants a man who listens, who understands, who treats her like a queen. And you believed her. You showed up with your best smile, your most respectful tone, your open heart. You offered your time, your energy, your attention, like a loyal knight offering his sword to a woman who hadn't even decided if she respected him yet. You thought this would make her stay, but instead, she disappeared. And the silence that followed wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. Here's the truth no one told you when you were younger. A man who offers himself fully without being asked, without being tested, becomes invisible. The world doesn't reward the good guy who bends first. It steps over him, not because he was wrong for being good, but because he had no edge, no boundary, no mystery. When a man is too kind too early, it's not interpreted as strength. It's seen as a cry for validation. And nothing kills attraction faster than the smell of emotional dependence hiding behind politeness. Most men were conditioned since childhood to believe that being nice would bring love, that smiling more, apologizing more, softening your voice, folding your instincts, would somehow convince someone to stay. But this version of kindness is not strength, it's surrender. And in the game of desire, surrendering first makes you disposable. Women don't reject kindness, they reject weakness disguised as kindness. There's a difference. One comes from power, the other from fear. A man who is kind because he chooses to be, while having the ability to be cold and untouchable, radiates power. But a man who is kind because he's terrified of being disliked, who fears silence, who chases with words every time she pulls away, he loses his shape. He becomes transparent. Think back to the last time you opened up too soon. You probably felt it. That moment when you sent that message, poured out your feelings, told her she meant something, and then waited and waited, only to realize she didn't feel what you felt. Not because you weren't worthy, but because you gave her everything before she even had to wonder if she deserved it. That's not love, that's sacrifice. And sacrifice without recognition becomes background noise in a world that only respects presence when it's felt as power. Machiavell, the ruthless strategist of influence, would never have advised a man to offer loyalty before interest. He understood a brutal truth. People value what they have to earn, not what's handed to them on a silver plate. And in love, especially modern love, a man who offers everything without creating tension, without causing reflection, is not loved. He's tolerated until something or someone more interesting appears. There's a tragic irony in all of this. Because you thought your kindness would protect you. You thought being good, present, emotionally available would make you irreplaceable. But what actually happened is that you became predictable, safe. And safety doesn't stimulate the part of the mind that desires. Danger does, uncertainty does, challenge does. A woman cannot desire a man she pities. And yet that's what happens when you present yourself as too eager, too open, too soft. You stop being a mystery. You become a therapist, a provider, a background character in a story she's not even sure she wants to keep reading. You want to be respected? Start with this. Withdraw the performance. Stop being the version of yourself that was built to please her. That version is a mask and she sees it. She may smile at it. She may say, "You're so sweet," but she doesn't feel pulled toward it. She doesn't dream about it. She forgets it. Men who are remembered don't always say the right thing, but they say it without apology. They're not cruel, but they're clear. They're not mean, but they're sharp. They know that kindness only has power when it's backed by boundaries. Without it, it becomes a leash. One she didn't ask for and doesn't respect. You were told that women want romance, affection, deep conversations, and some do, but not from everyone, only from the ones they admire. And admiration doesn't come from compliance. It comes from presence, from gravity, from a sense that you are not moved by every word she says, that you can be kind, but only when it's earned, that you can be generous, but not desperate, that your value doesn't depend on her reply. There is a primal part of the feminine mind that craves the chase, the uncertainty, the silent question of, does he like me as much as I like him? And when you eliminate that tension by exposing all your feelings too soon, you destroy the very space where desire grows. This is why the men who don't care as much often win, not because they're better, but because they're perceived as independent. And independence, even if just projected, is magnetic. It's what makes someone lean in, not pull away, because mystery makes you unforgettable. The worst part, you probably know this. You've seen it happen. You've watched women chase men who treated them like options while you were offering devotion, and you told yourself they just like bad boys. But it's not about being bad. It's about being unshakable, not emotionally naked with someone who hasn't earned that privilege. You keep giving away the full story before she even asks for the first chapter, and then you wonder why she closes the book. You want to be desired? Stop narrating your emotions. Let silence speak for you. Let your absence raise more questions than your presence ever answered. When you pull back, not to manipulate but to regain your center, you become someone she watches, studies, desires, because she doesn't want a man who folds. She wants a man who remains still when everything around him trembles. And you can't fake that. It comes from rebuilding yourself and piece by piece until your value no longer depends on being liked, but on being real. You tried to explain yourself. Again. You told her how much you cared, how loyal you were, how different you were from the others. You thought your words would open her eyes, make her see the depth of your soul, the purity of your love. But they didn't. They landed flat. Not because you weren't honest, but because honesty, when spoken too often, sounds like noise, and no one chases noise. They chase silence. You thought speaking more would fix what your silence failed to do. But what you didn't realize is that your silence never failed. Your silence terrified her because it made her feel uncertain, and uncertainty creates gravity. It makes people lean in, search for clues, wonder what they missed. But instead of letting her wonder, you revealed everything. Your fears, your insecurities, your emotional roadmap. You didn't just open the door, you left it wide open and begged her to walk in. But desire doesn't walk through open doors. It knocks on the ones that feel just slightly out of reach. Every time you reached out just to check in, to remind her you were still around, you confirmed a truth she didn't even have to say out loud, that she was the center of your world and you were orbiting her. That your time, your emotions, your worth, all of it was now subject to her attention. And there's nothing more suffocating than being the sole source of someone else's validation. You might think you were just being caring, thoughtful, emotionally available, but from her side it felt like pressure. It felt like emotional responsibility she never asked for, like a weight on her chest. The paradox is cruel. The more you give, the more you're avoided, not because giving is wrong, but because unreciprocated giving turns into guilt, and guilt repels connection. A man who gives without demand is noble, but a man who gives to be noticed is begging with a ribbon. You became the man she could always count on, but never feel pulled toward. She knew you'd answer, knew you'd stay, knew you'd forgive. That predictability kills intensity. It kills the thrill, and thrill is not a luxury and attraction, it's the engine. Why do you think the ones who treat her like an option often get prioritized? Because they present a challenge, a question, a tension that lives in the space between maybe he wants me and maybe he doesn't. And delegit, that space is painful. But it's where obsession is born. It's where emotions grow, not from comfort, but from chaos. Controlled chaos. The kind that makes her ask herself, what am I missing? Why hasn't he chased me like the others? You've been conditioned to believe that persistence is proof of love. But in reality, persistence often becomes proof of weakness when it's not met with effort from the other side. It's not your fault you thought showing up every day, texting her good morning, telling her how beautiful she is, would build a connection. It's what the movies taught you, what love songs taught you, what your own heart screamed at you to do. But romantic intensity without masculine frame becomes emotional noise. She hears the lyrics, but she doesn't feel the music, because the music comes from restraint, from the pause, from the glance that lingers and the text that never arrives. From the fact that you could reach out, but don't, not because you're playing games, but because you're playing for something higher, your own value. That's the word most men never learn to protect, value. They think value is in giving more, but real value is in knowing when not to give, when to walk, when to stop explaining yourself, when to make her feel your absence instead of begging her to accept your presence. You were taught to prove yourself to be loved. But what if love isn't something you prove? What if it's something you command, by who you are, by how you move, by what you refuse to tolerate? There's something magnetic about a man who doesn't flinch, who hears, "I need space," and answers with distance, not panic, who feels ignored and doesn't chase, he simply reclaims his energy. That kind of man isn't just attractive, he's dangerous. Not because he hurts others, but because he refuses to hurt himself to be seen. She needs to feel that you're not afraid to disappear, that you're not hanging by her text bubble, waiting for permission to feel good about yourself, that you could go quiet and not fall apart, that your world is bigger than her attention. And when she feels that, truly feels it, that's when you start to feel her come closer. This is the game no one taught you how to play, not the game of manipulation, but the game of emotional gravity, where silence is louder than words, where presence is not about quantity, but intensity, and intensity comes from self-respect, not drama. Do you know what happens when a man stops asking for attention and starts commanding space with his presence? Everything changes. The way she looks at him, the way she speaks to him, the way she tries to pull him in. Because now she's unsure, she can't predict his next move. And unpredictability, not romance, is what makes her heart race. You don't have to become cold, but you do have to become controlled, calm, centered, so that when you offer warmth it means something, not because it's constant, but because it's rare, because she had to earn it, and people only value what they earn. Keep giving warmth without limits, and she'll assume it's just who you are. Keep responding instantly, and she'll assume you have nothing better to do. Keep complimenting her every day, and she'll assume your words are cheap. But pause, pull back, let her feel the lack, and suddenly your silence will speak louder than every message you ever sent. You thought that being always available would make her feel secure, that replying fast, answering every call, being at her emotional service would somehow build intimacy. But you never realized that availability without edge becomes noise, and noise is forgettable. She doesn't remember the man who answered every time. She remembers the one who didn't and made her question why. This isn't about becoming cold or cruel, it's about becoming rare. When your attention becomes expected, it loses its flavor. But when it becomes a choice, a conscious offering of your energy, it becomes sacred. That's the paradox most men never grasp. The more predictable your affection, the less she feels it. But the more intentional it becomes, the more it burns. Think of it like oxygen. Too much, and you don't notice it. But take it away, and suddenly it's the only thing you can think about. When you were always available, she didn't have to ask herself who you were. She already knew. You were the one waiting, the one replying, the one giving more than receiving. But the moment you stepped back, even slightly, something shifted, not in her behavior yet, but in her curiosity. Because when something constant becomes quiet, the mind becomes loud. She starts wondering where you are, who you're with, why you haven't reached out. And that's not manipulation, that's nature. That's how human attention works. It goes where there's uncertainty. That's how desire functions. It needs space to breathe. Every man who's ever been deeply desired shares one common trait: mystery. Not because they're liars, but because they're self-contained. They don't leak their thoughts. They don't explain their every move. They don't turn their emotions into confessions just to relieve inattention. They own their space, and by owning it, they command attention. You might think that makes them emotionally unavailable, but it's the opposite. They're selectively available, and that selectivity creates value. Imagine walking into a room and knowing that everyone wants your attention, but you're not moved by it. You give it when it's earned, when it feels right, when it aligns with your energy, not because you're withholding, but because you understand your power. She doesn't want a man who bleeds approval. She wants one who makes her work for his attention, not because he's arrogant, but because he respects himself too much to give it away freely. Let's take it further. Imagine you stop texting first, not out of bitterness, but out of centeredness. You wake up, focus on your mission, build your life, and only then, if it aligns, you reach out. The energy is completely different. Now she senses that you have a life beyond her, that your validation isn't sourced from her replies, and that changes everything, because now you become the prize. The grounded, calm, emotionally intelligent man who doesn't move with emotional winds. You're not there to prove yourself. You're not reacting. You're not waiting. You're leading. And leadership in attraction doesn't mean control. It means direction. You decide the tone, the rhythm, the access. She either follows that rhythm or loses the music. Do you know what makes a woman rethink everything she assumed about you? When you stop being so accessible, when you go from the guy who needed her attention to the one who's not even chasing it anymore, that shift burns something in her, because now she's not sure if she ever had you, and humans obsess over what they can't confirm. That's why men who disappear strategically, not out of ego, but out of self-respect, leave a stronger mark than those who text paragraphs. That's why a man who can sit with his silence is more threatening than one who keeps explaining himself. Silence isn't just an absence of words, it's a presence of power. The man who can leave space between messages, between calls, between affections, teaches her something primal, that he doesn't need her energy to feel complete. And in a world where most men chase, validate, and overexpose their emotional hunger, that kind of restraint is rare, and what's rare is always remembered. But here's the twist. You can't fake it. She knows when your silence is rooted in pain and when it's rooted in power. If you're pulling back to manipulate, she'll feel the weakness behind it. But if you're pulling back because you're aligned with your purpose, because your energy is sacred, because you're not afraid of loss, then she feels the gravity. And that gravity makes her question her place in your life. It makes her evaluate her own presence. It makes her step into your frame instead of trying to pull you into hers. You don't need to announce that you're pulling back. You don't need to say, "I'm not chasing anymore." That in itself is seeking validation. True power is invisible. It's not declared, it's sensed. She feels it in the delayed replies, in the brief but potent interactions, in the fact that you're harder to read, not because you're hiding something, but because you're not performing, you're living. And when a man starts living more than proving, more than explaining, more than waiting, he becomes unforgettable. You said sorry again, didn't you? Even though you weren't wrong, even though you knew deep down that you were just trying to keep the peace. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you were afraid of losing her. And that's the exact moment she lost respect for you. It happens subtly. At first, she might even reward you for it. A smile, a soft tone, maybe a quick touch of affection. But underneath, a seed is planted. A quiet realization. You're not standing for yourself. You're not a man rooted in his own truth. You're someone who folds. And no woman, no matter how nurturing or romantic she pretends to be, desires a man who folds. There's a difference between kindness and submission. The nice guy confuses the two. He thinks that being agreeable will make him lovable. But love doesn't grow in places where there's no resistance. There's no fire in someone who agrees with everything. There's no edge, no risk, no tension. And without tension, there's no attraction, only convenience. She doesn't want convenience. She wants presence. She wants to feel your spine when she tests you. And yes, she will test you. Not because she's manipulative, but because nature wired her to. Women don't just want to feel loved. They want to feel safe. And safety doesn't come from softness. It comes from certainty. When she pushes a boundary, she's asking a question, do you know who you are, even when I challenge it? If your answer is hesitation, if your tone becomes passive, if your eyes drop in apology, you've already lost her on a level you'll never notice until it's too late. You'll think the relationship is fine. You'll think being supportive and flexible is keeping things together. Meanwhile, her attraction is bleeding out in silence. She might still be there physically, but emotionally, she's slipping away, drifting into fantasies of someone who doesn't explain himself, someone who commands a room without raising his voice, someone who looks her in the eyes and doesn't flinch when she's being dramatic, someone unshakable. Do you know what that looks like in real life? It's when she says something petty, trying to get a reaction, and instead of getting defensive, you look at her like, is that really who you want to be right now? That's not cruelty. That's leadership. That's emotional sovereignty. That's the moment she remembers why she felt something real for you in the first place. Let me tell you something most men never learn. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's boredom. And there's nothing more boring than a man who seeks permission to exist, who tries to get it right instead of being real. A man who is willing to risk being misunderstood in order to be authentic will always have more power than the man who tries to be understood at all costs, because true masculinity doesn't chase approval. It creates gravity, and gravity doesn't explain itself. Think about the men you admire, not the ones you were told to admire, the ones you feel something around, the ones whose energy shifts the room. They're not loud, they're not begging for attention, they're not overly emotional, they own their silence, they're not threatened by chaos. In fact, they bring order to it, not by force, but by stillness. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you were still? When was the last time you didn't chase clarity, didn't seek validation, didn't check in just to be safe? When was the last time you let her come to you? Most men don't wait long enough to find out what kind of woman they're really dealing with. They give too fast, open too soon, and beg for answers before there are even real questions. And every time they do, they dilute themselves. They become paler versions of who they could have been, if they had just held the line. You don't become respected by being understood. You become respected by being consistent, not in being nice, but in being solid. She's not looking for someone who agrees with her emotions. She's looking for someone who contains them, not suppresses, not dismisses, contains. Like a storm that hits a mountain, the mountain doesn't flinch. And when you start becoming that mountain, when you stop apologizing for your standards, your voice, your time, your vision, something shifts in her. Her chaos calms, her tone changes, her words slow down, because now she knows she's in the presence of a man who's not afraid to walk alone if necessary. The man who can walk alone is never truly alone, because people, especially women, are drawn to strength, not the strength of muscles, but the strength of boundaries. Don't be the man who texts just checking in. Be the man who doesn't need to check at all because he knows his value. Don't be the man who over-explains his absence. Be the man who is missed because his silence says more than any excuse ever could. And most importantly, don't be the man who lets fear of loss turn him into a version of himself he doesn't even respect anymore. Because every time you fold when you should stand, every time you bite your tongue to avoid tension, every time you dim your fire to make her comfortable, you're not keeping her. You're just delaying the moment she walks away, wondering why she ever felt anything for you in the first place. You spent so long trying to become the man she could love that you forgot to become the man you could respect. You bent your back so far to reach her heart, you never noticed your own spine snapping in the process. And by the time you realized you weren't being loved, you were just being used. It was already too late. Because you didn't lose her when she walked away. You lost her the moment she realized you would never walk away. That was the moment she stopped fearing your absence. That was the moment she knew your presence was guaranteed, no matter how she treated you. And a man who cannot leave is not a man to be kept. He is a servant with a smile. You called it love. You told yourself loyalty mattered. You thought your consistency, your affection, your transparency would be enough to change the ending. But she was never waiting for that. She was watching for proof that you had fire behind the kindness, proof that you had edge behind the sweetness, proof that you were not just another man trying to earn her, but a man she had to deserve. When you gave too soon, you told her one thing: my love is cheap. Let that sink in. It doesn't matter if you meant well. It doesn't matter if your heart was pure. What she felt was that your affection came with no cost, no challenge, no demand for recognition. And people don't value what is free. They consume it, drain it, and move on. You became the emotional vending machine. The man who always picked up, always answered, always came back. The man whose only real boundary was hoping she'd treat you better next time. But boundaries are not hopes, they are consequences. And she learned again and again that no matter what she did, you'd stay. Not because she was irresistible, but because you were afraid of being alone. Let's be honest, you didn't just fear losing her. You feared having to face the version of yourself that only exists when no one is validating you. You feared the silence, the mirror, the emptiness that comes after you stop trying to be needed. But that's the exact silence that makes kings. Machiavell never begged to be loved. He understood that love is fragile, transactional, and easily manipulated. But fear is rooted in survival. Fear commands attention, respect, and in relationships, as brutal as it sounds, being respected first is what makes love last. The man who is not feared will never be truly loved. Because love without fear turns into expectation. And expectation turns into entitlement. And entitlement kills desire. So what does this mean for you now? It means that every time you feel the urge to chase, you pause. Every time you want to make things right, you ask yourself, am I doing this because it's right, or because I'm afraid of being rejected? Every time you feel the pressure to prove your worth, you stop and remember your worth. Because if you have to convince someone to love you, they already don't. Let that hurt. Let it shatter every fantasy you've been clinging to. Let it strip away the illusion that more effort leads to more affection. Let it rip open the idea that being the good guy guarantees a happy ending. Because only when you let that illusion die can you become dangerous. And when I say dangerous, I don't mean cruel. I mean unavailable to disrespect, untouchable by emotional blackmail, unshakable when someone tries to test your value by pulling away. You don't chase, you don't beg. You withdraw, not to manipulate, but to preserve yourself. This is where everything changes. When she realizes that your silence doesn't come from weakness, but from control. When she sees that your absence isn't a punishment, but a statement. I will not compete for someone who was never worthy of me. That's when the power shifts. That's when she texts first. That's when she wonders where you went. That's when she questions the role she played in pushing you away. Not because she suddenly became enlightened, but because she felt the loss. And loss is the only thing that makes people reevaluate value. But here's the twist. By the time she feels it, you won't need her anymore. Because by then, you'll have finally remembered who you were before her, before the chasing, before the begging, before you turned your soul into a sacrifice on the altar of romantic validation. You'll have rebuilt yourself not as the man who is chosen, but the man who chooses. And that is the only kind of man she can't manipulate. You think you want her love, but what you actually need is your dignity. You think you want her attention, but what you truly crave is your own self-respect. You think the goal is to win her back, but the truth is, the real victory is never needing her again. Because the moment you become the man who can walk away without flinching, who can stare rejection in the eye and smile, who can be completely alone and feel completely whole, that's the moment you become unforgettable. Not to her, to you. Because this isn't about her anymore. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away so easily. And this time, you keep them.